I recently made a couple of videos talking about 10 essential Penguin classics that I can't live without. And then I made a follow-up, 10 essential Dover classics that I can't live without. And I wanted to keep that series going because it just is a fun way to explore my library. So today I'm going to do 10 vintage classics that I can't live without. What are your favorite vintage classics in your library? I would love to hear from you. Have you read any of these? What do you think of these writers or these books? These are essential books for various reasons. They're not necessarily my all-time favorite books by these writers or favorite books of all time. Some of them are, but they're just essential because they have, to use Kafka's words, been an axe to chop open the frozen sea within me. And I'm going to start with Kafka, the complete stories, and this lovely red spine vintage. This is just all-inclusive, all of his short stories. Of course, we have his fraught, nightmarish novels, The Trial and The Castle, and his incomplete novel, America, which is interesting, but it really feels like it was the skeleton of an idea that was not fully fleshed out. But Kafka's stories are superlative. There really is nothing quite like the vibrational psychic anxiety of a Kafka story, and there's an immense sense of compression in which even in the very shortest of these, like The Truth About Sancho Panza, The Silence of the Sirens, At Night, The Problem of Our Laws, these are some of these stories are really microfictions. They are a paragraph or two paragraphs at most. There is such a compression of energy and horrifying resonance in these stories that if you want to get into Kafka, this is essential. If you want to get into the power of a short story in its most concentrated, vivifying form, then you can't really do much better than the collected short stories of Kafka. He diagnoses the kind of neurotic alienation of modern life better than anyone, and I return to this over and over again. He said that great literature was an axe to chop open the frozen sea within us. And he, perhaps unknowingly, was the wielder of that axe. He just opens dimensions of the shadowy parts of human frailty and also a survival instinct. And he can be very, very funny as well. There is a kind of pervasive irony that is so cellular that sometimes we can glide through Kafka's stories without picking up on the scent of this kind of cosmic irony. Next up, I've got a Jane Austen here in the vintage red spine as well. I've got Northanger Abbey. Now, I've got all of Jane Austen's works in many volumes. I love all of her mature work. Her juvenilia is interesting and useful in terms of contextualizing our understanding of her artistic development, but her 6 mature novels are a zenith, revealing these vast and highly wrought mirrors that show us so much more of ourselves than surface appearances. Her work is all about the unending play of power and compromise between people in families and in society, and she had a very narrow range of material and of setting, 18th century aristocratic families and the hangers-on at the periphery of those families, but it doesn't matter because she used her material to create timeless art. I have vintage edition of Northanger Abbey. It's a nice floppy edition. Northanger Abbey, I really, really love this novel. It's an essential for me because it shows how a novel can be both playful and serious at the same time. It's not my favorite Austen novel, but it is super enjoyable. The first half does drag a little bit. Our heroine, Catherine, goes to Bath and gets her first taste of society. She's stepping out of this very sheltered, secluded childhood. But when she actually makes her way to Northanger Abbey, that is when the novel really springs to life. It's Austen's loving satire of Gothic romantic novels of that period of the 18th century. Catherine, having read loads and loads of these pulpy, overwrought, overheated romantic novels, pictures Northanger Abbey as this shadowy, spectral, haunted place. But then when she actually goes there, her expectations and the reality of the Abbey are thrown into comic relief. But it doesn't just spin off into parody. It does build and build and build so that we have like a kind of heart-wrenching longing for Catherine's happiness. Austen just does that kind of build-up of readerly desire and full-fleshed hope for the characters better than anyone. Next, I've got Ernest Hemingway's Immovable Feast. This is a really beautiful matte vintage classics edition. I just love this book. It's like a love letter to Paris and to being young and idealistic and hungry to find yourself and make your way in the world. If you've spent time in Paris, this book is like a snow globe, or it's like your love of that city captured in amber and preserved, so beautifully evoked. And it also gives us insight into Hemingway's formative years and his contact with the literati of the modernist movement in the 1920s, Fitzgerald, Gertrude Stein, Joyce, Proust, and so forth. But of course it is self-mythologizing. We can't take everything he says as objective truth, but it just carries you back to this time in Paris when, people were living in hotels and drinking in softly lit street-side cafes with Picasso and Ford Madox Ford, and a book that feels like an old friend, and I can't really do without it, so I had to include it here. Then I thought I would include another Hemingway, again in the classic red spine vintage edition. This is Across the River and Into the Trees. It's very tender. It's got a kind of tragic, unattainable atmosphere to it. It's an aging colonel who falls in love with a much younger woman, and there is a tenderness between them, but a kind of doomed, hopeless desperation and desire. And it's Hemingway facing his own mortality without being sentimental. And like Immovable Feast, this novel really captures the spirit of a certain place at a certain time. This book captures Venice post World War II, and there's a kind of faded, gaunt, hopeless beauty to this book. Next, I've got Virginia Woolf, The Common Reader. I've got all of Virginia Woolf's books, again in many different editions. She is one of my literary patron saints. This is one of the most stunning examples of the writer as critic. Virginia Woolf was so well read. This book is really inspiring. If you want to light the fire within you to read more, she must have started around the age of 6, 7, 8 or something like that, reading from her dad's extensive library, and she really read all through the classic works of Western literature and reread them up until her own time of the early and mid 20th century. She wrote incisive, vibrant essays about so many of the major works. Her essay on Chaucer will make you run to your shelf and take Chaucer down and revisit it. So I love Virginia Woolf, and I don't think her criticism gets spoken of often enough. Next, I've got Graham Greene, The Quiet American. Greene is one of the major writers in my own personal canon, and The Quiet American is my favorite of his works, and I've got it in this vintage, kind of unusual vintage classics edition. This book is like a prophecy. It foretells, it forewarns of American idealism going into non-Western places and sort of bringing this manifest destiny, this desire to democratize or Americanize or Westernize places that have an ancient and a separate history from Western ideals and Western values. And the dangers of that when you think you understand somebody or something or some group of people and or some culture, and you really don't understand it at all, and the damage that can bring. It's got this edition has an introduction by Zadie Smith, another writer that I love. So this is just a great combination. This is a love triangle between this enchanted English journalist and a young, wet behind the ears, naive American diplomat, and a Vietnamese woman. And it's not the only Graham Greene book with love triangles in it, but it is so superbly wrought, very touching, and I think while we always have the Greenian Catholic themes of guilt and duty and abstinence and sin and all of these rather dusty, moth-eaten themes, this book is a bit less cynical than, for example, another book with a love triangle, The Heart of the Matter, to take the sort of extreme side of Graham Greene's cynicism. This book has a somehow, in spite of the heaviness of it, in spite of the violence, in spite of the historical context, it does have some glimmers of light in it, and that comes through in the humor and in the tenderness of the love interests between the main characters. Graham Greene moves expertly from private, individual, specific, microcosmic level of interaction, of contact between two humans, and unfolds this grand macrocosmic level in which these relationships are extended all the way through to, you know, the geopolitical conflicts and ideological clashes between world powers. That dynamism of moving between the specific out into the general and back into the specific, that pattern you see through this novel. It kind of breathes, it kind of contracts and expands, coheres and then explodes and then falls back into place, and that movement through this book gives it a real momentum that carries you through, and it's a masterpiece. Then I've got William Faulkner, Absalom. Absalom, this book is Faulkner's kind of manifestation of his sense that history repeats itself and that progress is an illusion, and that seeming peace is sometimes like living above fault lines, tectonic plates that are about to shift and crack open the earth and consume everyone. That sounds super dark and heavy, and it is a super dark and heavy novel, but I include this in my essential vintage classics because he, I think, is almost second to none in his ability to carry these heavy themes. Like, I don't agree with half of what, or more than half of what William Faulkner believed or tried to evince through his fiction, but he is a very, very profound example of taking the heaviest of themes and spinning them into the most liquid, fluid, and crackling prose that is just electric. It's so alive and it's so finely enmeshed in the consciousness of the speakers, of the narrator. You feel like you are swimming through the thoughts of these characters, so that kind of fluidity, that flow is so counterpoised by the immense iron-heavy weight of the themes and the violence contained in these novels. It's not fun reading. I don't read William Faulkner every week, and I have reread quite a few of his works, but again, that is something that I don't do on a whim. I really have to G myself up. Now, Raymond Carver, what we talk about when we talk about love. Now, he's a prose stylist on almost opposite side of the spectrum to Faulkner. Faulkner is this like emulsion of consciousness oozing into long serpentine sentences and clauses. Carver is a prose stylist in a way that we can maybe compare more to Hemingway. He's really stripped down, understated, detached. He shows how so much can be said through what is omitted, and he really was a massive influence on on contemporary fiction writing. He dealt with very gritty subjects. His characters are just pretty downtrodden a lot of the time, and certainly they're not the grand chest-beating heroes of Hemingway. To compare him with Hemingway, Hemingway had the stripped-down style, but Hemingway's heroes are these kind of fallible but somehow kind of existentially staunch characters, whereas Carver, his characters are damaged, weather-beaten, careworn, normal American people trying to get by. There's something so generous in his desire to portray just average people. They're not heroes in the traditional sense at all, but there is a meticulous subtraction of everything superfluous. And what we're left with is this very spare, stark stories. You almost hear the wind whistling through the bones of these stories, but yet his choice of language, his choice of strategies are so strong, because the stories leave an indelible mark on you. You come away from them with a strange, inexplicable sense of profundity, even though in a way you feel like you're a fly on the wall, that you're just in some trailer, some trailer park or some crumbling moldy flat, and seeing just frazzled people trying to navigate the misery and drudgery of their lives. But that he made that his subject, I think, is so beautiful, because there are many people whose lives are not spent in Venice or in Paris, and to create art that captures and immemorializes those people, I think is a real service to humanity. Right, then to wrap it up, I've got two books here. Again, this is an interesting sort of vintage with a kind of blue livery, and this is Paul Auster and J.M. Coetzee, letters between the two of them. It's called Here and Now Letters, 2008 to 2011. Paul Auster passed away this year or last year. J.M. Coetzee is still alive, but he is in his 90s, maybe even heading towards 100 by now. And it seems at first like an unlikely friendship. They're both novelists, but beyond that, they're very different kinds of novelists. And Coetzee is a much more accomplished writer than Auster, has far more philosophical and aesthetic depth to his novels, in my opinion. But this is a really comforting read. This is a bit like some of these other works that I've talked about. Like it feels like an old friend. It feels like you're sitting at a dinner table or at a coffee table or at a breakfast table maybe, with these two novelists, and listening in on their chatter as they flit between literary allusion and personal memories, shared memories, strange occurrences. Auster always has this sort of obsession with coincidence in his fiction as well as in his letters. So this is such a consoling book by one very great writer and one decent writer, and I think it's an essential vintage classic for me. And yes, speaking of J.M. Coetzee, this is Disgrace in this, again, sort of different vintage edition. Disgrace is possibly his strongest novel. I would say it's up there with his strongest novels, along with maybe The Life and Times of Michael Kay. It's the story of a disgraced university professor who has a relationship with one of his students who's a young woman 20 plus years younger than him, and obviously there is this unethical dimension to you can't even call it a relationship, to their encounter or their encounters. It's quite unsettling, it's quite disturbing. But what Coetzee does so exceptionally well is he takes this power dynamic, a bit like how I talked about The Quiet American with Graham Greene. He takes this microcosmic level of two people, and you think this is just two people interacting, but he slowly uncovers layer upon layer of power dynamics and slowly unrolls this just vast entanglement of historical and socioeconomic connections and ties that bind all of the individuals that move through the pages of the novel, not just the disgraced Professor David Lurie or his student, but his daughter, who plays a big part in this novel, as well as some of the other characters. He takes these individuals, he shows how intensely tangled and bound up they are in the historical roots of the place in which they live, and how the struggle for agency is just so thwarted at all stages by all of these deep echoes and resonances, streetwise allegory that can, defend itself in a bar fight, or can get a tooth pulled without painkillers. It's not allegory of the flimsy sort. It's really allegory in a way that is almost inseparable from straightforward reality. And Coetzee always has this immense doubleness, this pervasive irony. He was very influenced by Kafka, so it's not so surprising to feel that connection between Kafka's stories and Coetzee's work. This little subtle but immutable irony that reveals the pity and the pathos of these small individual lives, and the tragedy of trying to live by principles, and trying to be independent and be an individual when the forces of history and of circumstance and of politics take such a toll on the pathways that we have open to us. It's very much sort of ruminations on otherness, and who gets to speak and for whom. And like all good fiction, or like all good art, it doesn't just throw up answers and tell us this is what you must think. It rather raises unsettling questions, one after another, questions that you can spend a lifetime reconfiguring and rephrasing, and you will only lead your way to deeper questions. But that is the power of art, to make us think deeply and to question our comfortable assumptions. I'm going to leave it there. Those are my 10 vintage classics that I can't live without. What are your favorite vintage classics in your library? I would love to hear from you. And have you read any of these? What do you think of these writers or these books? Yeah, thanks very much for watching, and hope to see you again soon.